It was one of those evenings in London where the sky draped itself in navy velvet and the city lights winked like they knew a secret. Inside St. James's Palace, the Royal Charity Gala was ticking along with all the usual pomp. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light over gowns worth more than some country houses. You, my dear listener, would have thought it was just another safe, scripted royal affair, but you'd be wrong. I had my eye on the seating chart earlier that day. Yes, I know someone who can get me a peek, and something instantly felt off. There was an unplanned gap in the program, a slot no one seemed willing to talk about. You can probably guess where this is going. The chatter in the room dimmed as the master of ceremonies cleared his throat. Then, like a plot twist in a movie, Princess Charlotte, yes, 10-year-old Charlotte stepped forward in a satin dress the exact shade of champagne bubbles. She wasn't on the original speakers list, which meant either a daring last-minute decision or someone very high up had quietly approved it. Between you and me, I felt the tiniest electric jolt. I've seen enough royal events to know when something unexpected is about to ripple through centuries of tradition. And this, darling, was exactly that moment. Here's a little-known fact for you. Even at public events, royal children rarely speak without weeks of rehearsal and palace communications approval. Any deviation? Practically unheard of. The girl walked with the poise of someone twice her age, clutching a single folded sheet of paper. All eyes locked on her. But mine drifted to Queen Camilla for just a second. She was still, almost frozen, lips pressed in that polite royal smile that hides everything and nothing all at once. You could feel it, the shift in the air, the realization spreading like spilled ink through the room. Something was about to happen that no press release could control. And as Charlotte reached the podium, the air went still enough to hear the faint rustle of silk in the back row. The Royal Charity Gala had always been a study in precision. Guests were choreographed like dancers, every champagne flute refilled at the same moment, every bow and curtsy timed to the beat of the orchestra. That night was no exception until it was. Let me paint you the scene, dear listener. The palace's white drawing room glowed in soft amber from dozens of candelabras, their flames trembling as if they sensed the disruption in the evening's script. The air was perfumed with a blend of white roses and something more elusive, that old wood scent unique to rooms that have absorbed centuries of whispered secrets. From my vantage point near the back, I could see the top table perfectly. King Charles, in his impeccably tailored dinner jacket, leaned ever so slightly toward Queen Camilla, who was seated to his right. William and Catherine sat opposite, Catherine's hand resting lightly on her lap, the faintest smile tugging at her lips like she already knew this moment was coming. And then there was Charlotte, her chair now empty, her small frame making its way toward the podium. I have to admit, I'd done my homework on her. Few people outside palace circles know that Charlotte has a natural memory for speeches. A staff member once let slip that she could recite a 5-minute address after hearing it just twice. Combine that with the fact she's been attending events since she was barely out of a pram, and you begin to understand why she seemed completely at ease under those relentless lights. The audience was a who's who of Britain's aristocracy, sprinkled with Hollywood charm. A certain Oscar-winning actress in a midnight blue gown, a racing magnate whose cufflinks were studded with sapphires, and a tech billionaire rumored to be eyeing a knighthood. They all turned as one to watch the young princess. I caught the faintest murmur behind me, someone betting she'd merely say a polite thank you and sit back down. But I could see more in her stance. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, that same determined spark her late grandmother, Princess Diana, once carried into rooms full of skeptics. And here's your micro fact for this part. The white drawing room has been used for state portraits since Queen Victoria's reign, meaning Charlotte was quite literally standing where monarchs have been immortalized for over a century. I glanced back toward the king. His expression was neutral, though his fingers tapped lightly on the table, an old habit he has when something unexpected is unfolding. Camilla's gaze was fixed on Charlotte, unreadable, though there was a flicker, just for a second, that told me she was measuring the implications. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Catherine give a slow, deliberate nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to register if you were watching for it. I couldn't help but wonder if this whole thing had been orchestrated from the shadows of Kensington Palace. And as the orchestra's music faded to a respectful hush, Charlotte reached the lectern, unfolded her paper with deliberate care, and looked straight into the crowd. The silence that followed wasn't the polite quiet of a royal audience, it was the kind of stillness that comes when people realize they might be witnessing a shift in the old order. The first words out of Charlotte's mouth were soft, almost conversational, but they carried across the gilded room like a ripple over still water. "Good evening, everyone." A simple greeting, yet it had weight, the kind of weight that makes you sit up straighter without realizing it. Her voice wasn't the high-pitched chirp of a child, it was measured, deliberate, the vowels rounded with the polish of countless elocution lessons. I noticed something immediately. She wasn't reading from her notes. The paper she held was barely glanced at, as if it was there for protocol rather than necessity. That alone was unusual. Royals, especially the younger ones, stick to scripts like glue. They are trained to avoid even the smallest improvisation because every word will be dissected by tomorrow's headlines. But Charlotte? She was steering without the map. Between you and me, my pulse ticked up right then. I've seen enough carefully managed royal appearances to know when someone is coloring outside the lines. And believe me, this girl was sketching her own picture. She spoke of the evening's cause, weaving in anecdotes about meeting young people whose stories aren't told in the bright rooms of palaces but deserve to be heard. It was polished but had an edge, one that made you wonder whether she was speaking only about the charity. I caught a subtle shift at the top table. Camilla's fingers tightened ever so slightly around her wine glass stem. William's gaze flickered from Charlotte to Catherine, as if to check whether this was planned or a very public curveball. Here's your microfact for this part. Within the royal family, there's an unwritten code that speeches should avoid any comment that could be interpreted as criticism, direct or indirect, of the monarchy's traditions. It's one of the reasons royal speeches can sometimes sound bland to outsiders. Tonight, Charlotte seemed blissfully or intentionally unaware of that rule. As she spoke, the room's mood shifted from polite interest to something sharper. The Oscar-winning actress leaned forward, her diamond earrings swaying. The racing magnate whispered something to his companion, who raised an eyebrow. Even the footmen along the walls seemed unusually focused, eyes fixed on the young princess instead of the guests they served. Charlotte's eyes swept the room, making brief, intentional contact with people scattered across the audience, including, for a fleeting second, her grandmother by marriage. Camilla's smile never faltered, but her eyes narrowed the tiniest fraction a look I've seen before when a comment lands closer to the bone than expected. At one point, Charlotte paused. It wasn't the pause of someone losing their place. It was the kind that lets a thought sink in. Titles, she said, can open doors, but kindness keeps them open. A lovely sentiment on the surface, but in this setting, with these listeners, it was almost provocative. I swear you could feel the temperature shift by a degree. I couldn't help thinking back to something I'd heard from a former palace aide over coffee months ago. He claimed Charlotte had once asked her mother why people bowed to her, and after hearing the explanation, she'd said, "That's nice, but I'd rather they smile." It was an innocent remark from a child, but in the right or wrong context, it sounded like a quiet manifesto. From my corner, I noticed Catherine's expression had settled into a calm, steady gaze, but there was a glint there too. Proud? Defiant? Maybe both. Charles, for his part, had leaned back in his chair, hands folded, the faintest trace of a smile that could be either amusement or admiration. The crowd was completely hers now. Even the string quartet in the corner looked mesmerized, bows hovering above the strings as if reluctant to break the spell. I realized we had crossed a threshold. This was no longer a charming moment of youthful enthusiasm. It was something bigger. And just when I thought she might wrap it up neatly, Charlotte's tone shifted, her voice gaining a subtle intensity that made the air seem denser. That, my dear listener, was the exact second I knew we were headed somewhere the palace PR team would never have signed off on. The moment Charlotte's voice took on that sharper edge, my instincts kicked in. Something about the cadence, the choice of words, it wasn't accidental. She was building toward a point, and I could practically hear the collective inhale from the palace's communications team, wherever they were stationed in the room. Backstage, or rather, just behind the paneled double doors of the white drawing room, there had already been whispers earlier that evening. I'd overheard one of the junior aides mutter into a phone that the list has been altered, and that there's no time to clear it with the press office. Those two sentences alone could set off a quiet panic in royal circles. For a family whose every public word is vetted, changed, and vetted again, an unscheduled addition is the equivalent of tossing a pebble into a glass of champagne small. but guaranteed to disturb the surface. Here's your microfact for this part. Every royal event has what's called a running order, a minute-by-minute plan approved days or weeks in advance. Deviating from it is rare, and when it happens, it's usually because of a security concern or an unavoidable delay. Spontaneous speeches? Almost unheard of in modern times. I'd later learn from a very reliable source, someone who knows the ins and outs of the gala's organizing committee, that Charlotte's speaking slot had been penciled in at the 11th hour by someone in Kensington Palace. It was pitched as a short thank you to the charity workers in attendance. What wasn't mentioned was that she'd been quietly working on her own version of that thank you, one that leaned far more on empathy and observation than ceremony. As she continued, she described meeting a young boy through the charity who had been told to stay quiet because his story was too sad. Her eyes didn't leave the audience, but you could sense the weight of those words landing. She spoke about how voices small, shy, even trembling still deserve to be heard, especially in rooms like this one. I glanced toward Camilla again. This time, the smile was tighter, and she took a sip of her wine without looking down, a tactic royals use to buy themselves a second or two before reacting. Charles's gaze was steady on Charlotte, his expression giving nothing away. William had the faintest crease between his brows, while Catherine's composure hadn't shifted an inch. Behind the scenes, though, you could imagine the silent choreography of aides exchanging quick looks, weighing whether this was a harmlessly heartfelt moment or the start of something that would need clarifying in the morning's press. Palace staff are trained to think 3 moves ahead, and I could almost see the headlines flickering through their minds. The press corps stationed discreetly at the back were already lifting cameras and adjusting lenses. A BBC correspondent was scribbling furiously, and one of the tabloid photographers took a calculated risk, stepping just a little closer to get a cleaner shot of Charlotte framed by the golden backdrop. Then, in a detail most people missed, one of the senior aides slipped out of the room, phone pressed to his ear. My guess? He was updating someone higher up, perhaps even the private secretaries, on what was unfolding. Moments like these can't be left to chance. Charlotte's tone softened again as she thanked the charity for its work, but by then, the message had already been delivered. She had planted an idea in the minds of everyone present, one that was far less about charity galas and far more about who gets to speak in royal spaces and how. Between you and me, I think that's why Camilla's reaction mattered so much. She's a master of reading the subtext in any room. If she suspected this was more than an innocent speech, she'd already be calculating how to manage the narrative before it spun out of control. The applause when Charlotte finished wasn't just polite, it was warm, sustained, almost indulgent. Some guests even rose to their feet, though not enough to call it a full standing ovation. She curtsied, returned to her seat, and picked up her water glass with the same composure she'd had walking to the podium. From the outside, it looked like a charming interlude in a glittering evening. But from where I stood, I knew we'd just witnessed the kind of moment that sends quiet ripples deep into the corridors of the palace. And ripples, in the right conditions, have a way of becoming waves. If the front of the room was all polished, smiles, and restrained applause, the energy in the private reception that followed was another story entirely. The Royal Charity Gala had a tradition. Once the speeches wrapped, the top-tier guests would filter into the adjoining music room for champagne, petites fours, and just enough unguarded conversation to make the royal press officers sweat. Tonight, that room was practically humming. Clusters of aristocrats and power players leaned in close, voices pitched low but urgent. The Oscar-winning actress was animatedly recounting Charlotte's remarkable composure to a pair of fashion editors. The racing magnate's wife was already speculating whether the speech signaled a new PR direction for the younger royals. And in the corner, the BBC correspondent and a rival tabloid reporter were hunched over their phones, trading theories like currency. Between you and me, that's when the first real spark caught. I caught sight of one of Camilla's closest aides quietly steering her toward a quieter alcove. The Queen Consort's face was still perfectly arranged, but I'd been watching her long enough to spot the tiny tell her right hand brushing against her bracelet, a subconscious habit when she's irritated. She listened as the aide murmured something, her only outward reaction, a single, slow nod. Here's your microfact for this part. In royal etiquette, a queen consort almost never comments publicly on a fellow royal's speech unless it's a pre-cleared compliment. Silence, in this world, can be louder than any words. Across the room, William was speaking with Charles, their heads inclined close. Catherine was chatting with a charity trustee, but every so often her eyes flicked toward her daughter, who was now perched on a velvet settee sipping apple juice, as if she hadn't just thrown a conversational grenade into the middle of Britain's most tradition-bound institution. Then it happened, the moment that would turn whispers into open speculation. A well-connected society columnist approached Camilla, perhaps emboldened by the champagne, and asked, sotto voce but still audible to me, "Was that planned?" Camilla's smile tightened a fraction. "Every speech is a gift," she said smoothly, "though some are more surprising than others." It was a masterclass in diplomacy, but the raised eyebrow that followed undid the neat bow she'd tried to tie on the moment. That eyebrow was photographed, and within hours, it would be circulating in private WhatsApp groups among the press, a tiny but potent seed for 100 different headlines. The tension was now almost tactile. Some guests seemed eager to align themselves with the young princess's candor, while others whispered about the need for discipline and the importance of protocol. A few even invoked the name Diana, which in this family is less a compliment and more a coded warning about going off script. Charlotte, blissfully or perhaps intentionally unbothered, chatted with a group of children from the charity, crouching so she was at their eye level. One of the palace photographers, sensing a more palatable shot for tomorrow's front pages, snapped away, capturing her laughter in soft focus. Damage control in real time. By the time the reception wound down, the factions had formed. Those charmed by her boldness saw it as a breath of fresh air in a sometimes stifling tradition. Those unsettled by it saw it as a potential PR liability. And somewhere in the middle stood the king, the queen consort, and the Prince and Princess of Wales, each calculating the ripple effect in their own way. As the last guests were ushered toward the palace gates, the night air carried a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The gala had ended, but the story was only just beginning, and the palace knew it. By dawn, the golden glow of the gala had dissolved into the harsh blue light of early headlines. The eyebrow photograph of Queen Camilla, paired with Charlotte's "Titles open doors, but kindness keeps them open," quote, sat side by side on at least 3 national front pages. The tabloids went for punchy angles: Little Princess, big statement, Charlotte's bold debut, and more provocatively, Camilla caught off guard? Inside the palace, the day started with a flurry of calls. The communications office had drafted a short, polite statement thanking the charity for its inspiring work and praising all speeches delivered. Between you and me, that phrasing was a deliberate umbrella, meant to acknowledge Charlotte without highlighting her words too much. The palace doesn't like to feed the beast, as one seasoned aide once told me. Here's your micro-fact for this part. The Royal Rota press system allows a select pool of reporters inside events, but those reporters also know which questions are off-limits if they want to keep their coveted access. The gala coverage was now testing that unspoken contract. Social media, of course, had no such contract. Clips of Charlotte's speech, shaky from guests' smartphones, were already racking up millions of views. The comments section was split between admiration for her maturity and speculation about a growing divide between the younger royals and the more traditional wing of the family. The Diana comparisons surged again, this time with side-by-side videos of mother-in-law and granddaughter, each speaking earnestly to crowds. Behind the scenes, aides were triaging. William and Catherine's team fielded requests for an official transcript of Charlotte's speech, requests they quietly declined, citing the gala's private nature. Camilla's office issued no comment beyond the joint palace statement, while Charles kept to his pre-planned schedule, greeting foreign dignitaries with no public reference to the previous night. By mid-afternoon, the BBC was hosting a panel discussion on the future face of the monarchy, with Charlotte's speech as the jumping-off point. One commentator suggested it was a carefully planted test balloon for a more modern, accessible royal image. Another warned that it risked undermining the principle of unity if individual royals started freelancing with their messages. In Kensington Palace, Charlotte was reportedly back to her normal routine schoolwork in the morning, ballet class in the afternoon. But anyone who understood the workings of the royal ecosystem knew this moment had already been logged in the unwritten ledger of palace history. It was one of those points to which future narratives might return, polished and reframed, or quietly omitted, depending on how the winds blew. As evening fell, the story had reached the international press. American morning shows ran the clip alongside breathless commentary, while European outlets debated whether Britain's young princesses could become the monarchy's strongest diplomatic assets. All the while, the palace maintained its silence, an old strategy that can either smother a story or let it grow wild depending on what the public decides to do with it. I had a feeling this one wasn't going to fade quickly. The rain had started by the time I left the palace grounds that night, fine and cold, turning the cobblestones into mirrors that caught the glow of the street lamps. The gala was over, the guests gone, but inside those walls, the echoes of Charlotte's words were still moving through the corridors, slipping under doors, settling into the corners where memory lingers longest. Dear listener, you can feel it when a shift has begun. It's not loud, it's not dramatic. It's that quiet certainty that something won't go back to how it was. And I'm telling you now, this was one of those nights. Between you and me, I caught sight of an unmarked black car pulling into a side entrance as I left a senior aide stepping out. Collar turned up against the drizzle, phone already at his ear. Whatever conversation that was, it wasn't about the floral arrangements. Here's your final micro fact. In the monarchy, major shifts often start with something small, a word unscripted, a gesture unplanned. And those moments, once they slip into the public consciousness, are nearly impossible to take back. The next official family appearance is only days away, at a much larger public event with cameras from every corner of the globe. Charlotte will be there, so will Camilla. And if you think the photographers won't be watching for the smallest glance, the tiniest smile or lack of one, you haven't been paying attention. This, my friend, is just the first move. The real game is about to begin.